welcome to our Sunday festival here at ISKCON Dublin. ISKCON, you may hear that word sometimes, just in case you're not familiar. It means the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. So it looks like an international audience here today. I just met Nico from Galicia in Spain, who is here for the first time, or the second time maybe.
I came yesterday, I think,
yes,
to take a look at the first time.
But he's been to our centre in Soho Street in London, so he's from Spain, and he's been to our centre in London, now he's in Dublin, so it's a little international, European international. There's one verse in the Bhagavad Gita, na jayate mirte vakadachin, nayam bhutva bhavita vanabuya, ajon jo shastatam yam parano, nahanyate hanyamane sharire. I was just going to talk a little bit on that today, and that English translation of that. By the way, is there anybody else here? Nico's here for the first time in Dublin. Anybody here for the first time?
I'm Laura's guest.
I'm
here for the first time.
And is it your first time to an actual Hare Krishna temple? Oh, you're very welcome. What's your name?
Mohini.
Mohini. That sounds like the type of name that you should have been to a Hare Krishna temple before. It should be your first time.
I was born 60 years ago in Delhi.
Sure.
And this name, I got
Mohini.
my grandmother's.
It's a wonderful name. It's the name for Krishna. Okay, so that verse that I just quoted is from the Bhagavad Gita, and Bhagavad Gita means literally the Song of God, and it was spoken, or sung I should say, by Krishna 5,000 years ago. And that particular verse, Najayate Mirte, means for the soul there is never birth nor death, nor having once been do we ever cease to be. We're unborn, eternal, everlasting, and we are not slain when the body is slain. So that's what that verse is. For the soul there is never birth nor death, nor having once been does the soul ever cease to be. And the soul is unborn, undying, everlasting, and is not slain or is not killed when the body is killed. So, what I'm going to do now though is chant Hare Krishna a little bit more. But we can maybe meditate on those words of Krishna in terms of the soul and what they actually mean. And then I also was sent a news article this week that I wanted to relate to, connected to that verse that I just spoke. Okay. Param Vijayate Shri Krishna Sankirtan Ki, Srila Prabhupada Ki. Om Ajana Tamarandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Unmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Shri Chaitanya Manovishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayarupa Gadamayam Dadati Swaha Padantikam. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shri Vasavi Gauda Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So, as I was saying, Najayate Mriyate Bhagavadachin, that for the soul there is never birth nor death, nor having once been does the soul ever cease to be. The soul is eternal, unborn, undying, everlasting, and is not slain when the body is slain. I suppose the first thing to emphasize or focus on in relation to that particular statement is that the last line where it says, the soul is not slain when the body is slain. There's one great sage from ancient India, who I'm sure you've probably heard of. His name is Yudhishthira Maharaj, one of the Pandavas.
Yeah.
And he was asked one time, what is the most amazing thing that you see or that you've experienced or that you identify in this world that we live in, this material world? What's the most amazing thing? And he didn't think about it, he didn't have to think about it, he immediately responded, I've forgotten the Sanskrit, was it? Hanyani Yabhutani. He responded that the most amazing thing in this world is that every single one of us, every one of us in this world, except my little baby friend, he's not old enough yet, and maybe this little girl too, but everyone in the world has experience of somebody they know dying, or the body getting slain, as to use the words in this verse. So we all have that experience. In my own case, all my full grandparents have long since gone. I only ever knew really one of my mother's mother, actually. I didn't really know my other grandparents. Both of my parents have left. Even one of my siblings has actually passed away. So we all have that experience, that there's somebody in our family or somebody that we know, friends, that have actually passed away. So Maharaj Yudhishthira said that for him the most amazing thing is that although we all have that experience, we all tend to live our lives as though it won't happen to us. Not that we never necessarily think of it, actually Srila Prabhupada, who translated, just for those who don't know, Srila Prabhupada, he's in the picture here. He's also in a smaller picture up there. Anyway, you'll see pictures of Srila Prabhupada, who was the gentleman who brought all this information to us, and we wouldn't be here today, actually, without him. Here today, meaning here in this room, talking about philosophy. But he said real philosophy, because, philosophy, to use the vernacular, in some circles at least, it's kind of a sexy subject, and people they think they're talking philosophy, but actually they're just speculating and all sorts of different ideas and thought processes and whatever. So Prabhupada said real philosophy means to always keep death right in front of you. That's real philosophy, always to be aware of that this body is coming to an end. But most of us, we don't do that. We certainly don't do that as a sort of 24/7 thing, that's for sure. Some of us may do it, but for limited periods of time. And many people, they do the exact opposite. They want to actually forget about that. That's something they just don't want to think about. That's morbid, that's negative or whatever, and they just don't want to think about it. So, another example, of course many of you may not know this, but I remember as a kid, I was a little older than a kid actually, I would have been a teenager, when computer games were starting to come out, I think the first one they had was a thing called Space Invaders, that was the first universal computer game, I think, and it developed in a few, but one of the early ones was a thing called Lemmings. And the Lemmings game, I'm not even sure exactly what the game was, but anyway, you had all these little lemmings, they looked like lemons actually, yellow things, small things. And all they did was they kept on walking forward, marching forward, and all that was ahead of them was a cliff edge. And they would just walk off the cliff and just fall off the cliff without any thought process and whatever. I think you were meant to try and protect them and create routes for them to save themselves. But for them, if they were just left to their own devices, they were just walking and dropping off the edge of a cliff all the time. So, not that Prabhupada used that particular example, but it's similar in terms of Maharaj Yudhishthira's point, that everyone knows this is going to happen, but we all live our lives as though it's not going to happen like that. So this verse is explaining that, and it's explaining more. It's explaining who we actually are, that we're the eternal spiritual being. So, but in general terms, a book like Bhagavad Gita on these types of subject matters, they're what you call a primary source of knowledge. They're like an absolute primary source of knowledge. And really, that's all we need. We just need that primary source of knowledge. But at the same time in life, people also like secondary and supplementary sources of knowledge. For whatever reason, maybe they can relate more to something or whatever, or they like the feeling of something being reinforced or endorsed by other sources of knowledge like that. So as I was saying before we chanted, that one person sent me a little report this week, and this would fall into the category of being a supplementary or a secondary source of knowledge for the verse that I just quoted from Bhagavad Gita. And this was recent, this happened recently, I'm not sure the exact time frame, but within the last sort of few months or so. And there was a 3-year-old boy in Israel, and he was from the Druze community. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Druze community, but it's a particular community primarily in Israel. And he was from that community, and children, they're different ages, but they usually start to try to talk, around 2, a little after 2, like that. But they don't usually perfect it, or at least perfect it to the degree that we can understand them until usually they're after 3 or sometime after 3. Kids kind of tend to develop at different ages. So this little boy, as soon as he could talk, around the age of 3, he was 3 and a half, as soon as he could talk quietly, he was insistent on telling his mother and father. Oh, by the way, he had quite a substantial birthmark on his forehead. One of those reddish wine-coloured birthmarks like that, long, kind of thin one that he had. And he was telling his mother and father that the reason he has this birthmark is because he was murdered in his previous life. And of course they didn't, take him so seriously, and they kind of didn't really want to discuss it with him. It's quite a heavy subject for a 3-year-old kid to bring up. I was murdered by a crazy axe man in my last life. Okay, go play with your toys. So then he goes over, takes out his toy axe. But so it's quite a wow. What would you do like that yourself if you were a parent? And your child was telling you that kind of thing. Anyway, he was very insistent, and in life, actually, in general, that tends to be the case. If someone is really insistent on something and very convincing in how they, particularly such a young little kid, you can't help them but take them seriously. It's like, how can you ignore this if they're consistently telling you this? And of course, they are your own flesh and blood, so you love them, etc. So he's very adamant, and then one day he told them that not only that this happened to him, but he told them where it happened, the village where it actually happened. And the village was actually in the neighbouring country, it was in Syria, where it actually happened. And this then they all, whatever, and I think they went to some friends and family, maybe to some priests or different people they went to, discussing this. And eventually it was decided anyway that they would go to this village and inquire, had this ever happened. Of course, the child himself didn't really have any time frame on it, at least at that time. But they thought they would go and see. When they went to the village, pretty much as soon as they arrived, and they went to some local people, I don't know, again maybe the priests, the teachers, some of the people like that. But as soon as they arrived in the village, he remembered his name from his previous life. The name came to him, and he told the name. Anyway, to cut a long story short, very quickly it was verified that this person that he named, whatever the name was, had been murdered in the village 4.5 years previously. So it was only a year and a half after he actually was born again as this little boy. And then there was another part to it, which has now just slipped my mind, another corroborating piece of evidence that this had actually happened. Then he remembered where the murderer had buried him. And he brought them to where it was, out on the outskirts of the town, in the fields somewhere. They brought them to that place, and they dug it up, and they found the skeletal remains of this man that had been murdered. And of course, there were still marks on the skeletal, on the what do we call it? Cranium. Yeah, no, that's a sophisticated name. I'm just thinking skull. Skull was the word I was looking for. Yeah. Thank you for that. That's the cerebral name of a skull. Cranium. Man who went to a good school, So either the skull or the cranium, whatever you want to call it. That they saw there was actually marks which corresponded to his birthmark that he now had on his head. That's not an unusual thing, actually. There are many stories like that go through, and as I say, it's kind of secondary, supplementary evidence, and really, in many respects, we don't need that secondary, supplementary evidence. We just need the primary evidence that comes from Shastra or scripture, like the Bhagavad Gita. But certainly when you read stories like that, if there are any doubts in your mind about the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita, these things very much can help to eradicate those doubts, because they give practical, these are philosophical and to some degree theoretical statements, but that then gives an actual practical example of what's behind the philosophy like that. So it should help us to understand this point, that for the soul there is never birth nor death. And the soul is not slain. The body is slain, and in this case this body was slain very viciously by some guy with an axe, so it was a very vicious slaying of the body. But regardless, and it's also an interesting point for us to maybe meditate on, that ultimately it doesn't matter. I remember one time giving a talk like this, and at the end of the talk I asked if anybody got any questions, and the question that came back, which I can answer that question if you all like, but I'm just giving it as an example. The question that was asked was, why does God allow people to get killed? And in this case, in very vicious ways. This was a man that was killed by somebody very violently with an axe like that. But the answer is also in Bhagavad Gita. There's one verse, Kalosmi. Kalosmi. Yes.
Oh,
Yes. Can you recite the whole verse? Kalosmi. Do you know? The first line. What did it say? The first line of Kalosmi.
From 10th chapter.
Yeah. Anyway, so there's one verse. There's one verse. Kalosmi me, and Krishna is saying, "Time I am, destroyer of the worlds." So sometimes we look to a situation like that and we think, wow, that's very heavy, that's very violent, that's very cruel, that's very callous like that, someone being slaughtered with an axe or something like that. Or we see a child and a child may get some disease, childhood disease, leukemia or something like that, and then they die very young or whatever. But actually, that passing, those passings, violent, young, whatever they may be, really, in the context of eternal time, whether someone, they're celebrating, I saw also on the internet the other day, the oldest man in Britain, I think he was 111, I think, was it 111, something like that. And they celebrate that as a glorious thing. Actually, I think they asked him, I thought this was quite funny, they asked him, what's the secret to your long life? And he said, oh, I just make strategies to avoid death. Well, guess what, mate? Time I am, destroyer of the worlds. But we tend to celebrate that, a long life. And from a relative perspective, there are differences, and I can understand the differences like that. But from an absolute perspective, from a philosophical perspective, in the context of eternal time, there really is no difference. There really is no difference. And particularly in the context of when we leave these bodies, if we haven't achieved perfection from a spiritual perspective, we will come back anyway. So there'll be another one, and another one, and another one, and another one. So in that context, it's not really so important what age we are, how we die. The point is that we all have to leave these bodies. And again, going back to Maharaj Yudhishthira's quote, that's the amazing thing. It will happen. It will also happen to that gentleman who's 111 and has been successful so far in strategizing to avoid death, but he will fail at some point. So that's really what the key issue is. The key issue, that event is happening for all of us, regardless of our age, regardless of where we live in the world, regardless of our external circumstances, whether we're wealthy, whether we're poor, whether we're healthy, whether we're sick, whatever it may be. It will come. So, yeah, that's the message. What time are we at now? Oh, 4:10. Okay. The message really that we understand that and focus on that, and then use whatever resources and energy and time that we have to. That gentleman saying he's strategizing to avoid death, and he was meaning literally in terms of his physical body. But what we should be doing, what we all should be doing, including that gentleman, is we should be strategizing to understand what quote-unquote death is, and according to Bhagavad Gita, it doesn't happen to us. It only happens to the body, but that isn't actually us. And it's only if we identify with the body being us, that we think, like, I'm thinking this is me, my arm and my chest and my head. It's only if I'm thinking like that I will actually experience death. If I'm identifying that I'm the eternal spirit soul, then I will not experience death, because there is no such thing as death for the eternal spirit soul like that. This, by the way, just happens to be the period in the Christian calendar known as Lent. So, because I grew up as a good Catholic, I used to always make a vow that every single Lent that I would break, within a few hours of making the vow. I think I used to make it late at night, so as that then I'd go to bed and I'd at least have one night of sleep where I wouldn't break the vow that I had made. But then the next morning, straight after breakfast, I'd break it. But you would make that. And actually, again, it's a little bit like understanding things clearly. So we can understand clearly from Bhagavad Gita that there is no death for the soul, but there is for the body. Whereas people who don't understand that principle, they think that they're dying. In the same way, Lent, if we understand that principle, because the principle is to be renounced, to actually renounce something. And that principle is a good principle. But it shouldn't be seen in the context of austerity. That's kind of more the point, you know. And I can remember so well as a kid. I remember, you know, whatever age I was exactly, me and my friends, we would dread Lent arriving, because the whole presentation of it was that it was like a negative thing. It was an austere thing. You had to give up something like that. But actually, the reason we were thinking like that was because the philosophy and logic behind such a thing wasn't really explained to us, and it always was seen. And in fact, you know, if you broke your vow, you'd try to hide it from your parents or your teachers or your priest or whatever, you know, because it was looked on badly like that. But actually, if it was explained to us that it's an actual super positive thing, because the whole understanding of practice of Krishna consciousness, or becoming conscious of Krishna, and Krishna, just in case anyone in the room doesn't know, Krishna is just a name. It means the most beautiful, all-attractive person, and it's just a name for the Supreme Person. That's all that it is. And the idea is that we become conscious of this Supreme Person. So the practice of spiritual life, or the practice of Krishna consciousness, is that fasting, or in the case of Lent, giving up something, is actually feasting. It's just a question of understanding things in the proper context. So as devotees will do their very best to abstain from illicit sexual activity, from meat eating, from gambling, from intoxication. Devotees of Krishna will endeavor not to engage in those 4 activities. But that's not a negative. That's a super positive. Actually, we refer to them as the 4 principles of liberation, that you become liberated if you can follow those principles. Because then your senses, because they're all sense related, you know, sex, intoxication, eating, all these things. So if you can actually control those things, you're liberated. You're not being dictated to by your senses. I've got to have a cigarette, I've got to have a drink, you know, I've got to take some drugs, I've got to have sex, I've got to eat this, that, or the other, I've got to go and gamble or whatever like that. It's liberating. It's not a negative at all. It's a super, super positive. It's a super positive thing, you know. Yeah, so what was I going to say? The 4 principles of liberation. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, and then just to connect those things, it's interesting in the world that we live in. You have an organization called Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Gamblers Anonymous. I think they also have, I don't know if they call it Sex Anonymous, I'm not sure what they call it, but there's some organization for people with sexual addiction, etc. Eating, of course, now has become something that's really, you know, many people struggle with on all different levels. I'm not sure, again, I don't know what the organizations are that try to help with it, but it's just very, very interesting. That's why we call them the 4 principles of liberation, because you won't become a slave to them. And people who do become a slave to those activities end up in all sorts of terrible situations. You hear of men, you know, who are married with a family, and they gamble their home away. You know, in the space of minutes, they can gamble their whole home away. And then the wife doesn't find out about it until the solicitor's letter arrives, or the bailiffs arrive to throw them out like that, and it creates so much pain and distress. Alcohol and drug addiction leads to all sorts of health issues, as well as eating disorders, intoxication. People just go crazy. The whole society can go crazy. So rather than, because sometimes people will present, you know, I give this example, maybe I've given it here before. Sometimes I do talks at schools here in Dublin, and oftentimes when you finish making your presentation and you ask for questions, I guess that the students have probably Googled, you know, Hare Krishna or whatever beforehand, and they see, you know, that we don't take drugs or whatever it might be. So you often get a question, a kid will put their hand up, you know, and will say, oh, you're not allowed to smoke, are you? And my reaction when I get asked that question is, well, who's going to stop me smoking? I can smoke if I want to. I mean, I can go out and buy myself, you know, whatever, 1,000 cigarettes and try to stuff them in my face all at the same time and smoke them simultaneously. Who's going to stop me smoking? Of course I can smoke, but I choose not to. Now, 9 times out of 10, the student asking that question is a smoker. And somehow or other, before they hear my answer, they're thinking they're superior because somehow or other they can smoke and I can't smoke. So my response, of course I can smoke. The difference is I choose not to. Do you smoke? And they'll say, yes, I do. The difference between us is I can smoke, but I choose not to. You do smoke and you can't stop. So we really have to understand these things in the proper context of being in control of our destiny, in control of what we do, in control of our thought processes, And it's really liberating. It's an incredibly liberating thing, and we should always see it in that context. And not only is it liberating, but then the actual prize, for want of a better word, because it's not really a prize, we don't see it like that, but you know, the kind of goal and the achievement at the end of it is that when you do leave this body, you're leaving it, quote unquote, on your terms. And that means that because we have controlled our senses, the senses are not going to dictate to us where we go next. And we do go somewhere. Simply understanding this verse, that there is, that for the soul there is never birth nor death, nor having once been does the soul ever cease to be. So because there is not birth and death for the soul, but there is birth and death for the body, when death takes place, the soul has to go somewhere. It's just such a logical, simple point. If the body's temporary and the soul, us, is eternal, the soul has to go somewhere. Now where it goes depends on us. It depends on our desire, and from our desire, our activities manifest. So if our desires are to enjoy our senses, to enjoy intoxication, enjoy sex life, enjoy eating whatever, and enjoy all these things, if that's what we choose to do, then that will be what dictates our next existence. Because that's what we desire. And desire leads us, leads the way, it shapes the way. And the desires become fixed in the mind. There's one nice verse in the Bhagavad Gita, anyway, whatever the mind is thinking of at the time of departure, as the soul is leaving the body, whatever the mind is thinking of, yam 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 vapi smara. Yeah, whatever the mind is thinking of at the time of departure, at the time what we call death, that is where we will go. The mind will lead us to our next existence. So we're meditating on, I don't know, you know, Ireland winning the Rugby World Cup, you know, or you know, my next Big Mac burger, or whatever it is, you know, whatever, because the mind is an incredible thing. The mind thinks of millions of things, practically speaking, in seconds. It can think of like unlimited things. So it's like a you know those horses in the cowboy movies, the wild horses before the cowboys get them under control, and they're just wild. They just run in every direction and go crazy. That's what the mind is like. And our job is we're meant to be like a cowboy who controls this thing called the mind. Because if we don't have it under control, it can think of any weird or wonderful thing at any point in time. So at the time of departure, if it's thinking of something really weird or really odd, you know, that's where we will be led to. So the whole goal of this existence now, and you know, the other thing to mention is that we now have an incredible opportunity to do that because we have this information in front of us. It's been given to us. As I say, it's all due to the mercy and compassion of this gentleman, Srila Prabhupada. But we have access to this now. We know we don't need that supplementary secondary evidence. We have the primary evidence right here in front of us. We know what the situation is. We know why we're here. We know what the options are in terms of where we can go, like that. So we should use this existence because we have the opportunity, because who knows, maybe next time around we won't have the same opportunity like that. We might not have it. So now we actually have the opportunity. We should use it as best as we can to ensure that this existence in the material world, this particular body, is the last body that we will die in, that we won't accept another one, that we have to go through that same process of birth, death, old age, and disease like that. Okay, I think I'll stop there, but if anybody has any questions, I'd very much like to hear some questions. Yes, sir.
Very interesting. I noticed that when he died in Vrindavan, his mind, his spirit, well, I don't know where it was, but you know, when one person wants to go somewhere, he needs a map, even for the soul, even for the spirit. So that will be a question: where does, like, how would the soul? I know it's depending on the action, but it's very obviously a very complicated question. Like, you know, how would the soul, like when the soul leaves the body, the soul I've heard that it's depending on what you think, what one person think when he dies. Yes, okay, that's one version. Understand? But I'm more like Cartesian in this way. Like there is always a map. Like there is even map of the universe. Like there is map. You know, the physician do some maps of try to do some type of attempt to do some map of the universe. You know, so in this way, you know.
Where? Is that your question? Yeah. Okay. So, you know, a little bit like primary sources of knowledge and supplementary sources of knowledge, the emphasis I was putting on controlling the mind and us dictating our destination as opposed to the mind dictating our destination. Actually, the specific destination isn't really important. What is important, and we read this time and time again from devotees like Prabhupada and all previous very elevated souls, is actually they don't care where they go. They don't actually care where they go. And they're not really interested in determining or choosing where they go. What they desire is whatever situation they find themselves in next time around, next time whatever, that they're able to engage in the service of the Supreme Lord. That's actually the goal. So the actual specific destination is really definitely very secondary and not so important. It's just that wherever we go, that we will be able to engage in the service of the Lord. Now, this whole creation, both spiritual and material, what's known as the Mahatattva, or the whole creation, at least 75% of it is the spiritual world. And the material world that we're in is a much smaller part of the whole overall creation. So by definition, if we want to serve the Supreme Lord, if we want to engage in devotional service like that, selfless devotional service, then there's at least a 3 out of 4 chance that we'll be in the spiritual world, because that's where. Actually, there's a bigger chance than that, because in the material world, although we can serve Krishna in the material world, you will see. You just have to observe, walking the streets of Dublin or any city or town on the planet. 99.9% of people are not actually serving the Supreme Lord. They're serving their senses. So that even reduces it even more. So simply by having that desire to engage in devotional service and to be able to serve the Lord and the Lord's devotees, you can pretty much guarantee that you'll be in the spiritual world. But ultimately it doesn't matter. Destination is not so important. It's just that we are able to continue to engage in the service of the Supreme Lord. And that's really it, by the way. I should mention that because religion tends to get a bad name in the world, and rightly so. In many respects, rightly so. It gets a bad name. You know how many times I met born-again Christians on the street will tell me that unless I accept Jesus, I'm going to go to eternal hell like that and whatever. That really there's only 2 religions. There's material life and there's spiritual life. They're the only 2 religions really. The other denominations that come about, they tend to come about, they're kind of man-made really, but really it's just material life and spiritual life. So you can have Christians and Hindus and Jews who are materialistic, you can have Christians, Hindus and Jews and Muslims, etc., who are spiritual. So what their particular coat that they wear or hat that they wear, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Hindu, that doesn't really matter. It's just whether we're engaged in spiritual life, because that's the only thing. Spiritual life versus material life. And spiritual life versus material life, in the context of material life, it means, am I serving my senses? Am I serving this temporary material body? That, by the way, as is explained in the first chapter of this book, that the material body is a fallible soldier. And what that means is that it will let you down. I can serve this body expertly all my life. I can give everything my senses want. I can surrender to that, and I can give my senses everything that they want. But they will let me down. My senses will let me down because the body will die. But not only will the senses let me down in terms of them dying and leaving me, but they'll also leave me with a horrible legacy of where I'm going, simply because I wanted to serve those senses as opposed to serving the senses of the Supreme Lord like that. So that's really the goal, that we focus on service, spiritual service, devotional service, bhakti yoga, and that then our destination, whatever it is in terms of its actual location, will be glorious. So we don't need to worry about the specific destination where we're going.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
In fact, I have two questions. One is, while walking, sometimes we kill ants.
Yeah.
And
What to speak of driving?
Yeah. No, that's a different story. And we also kill mosquitoes. So is it good, bad? How do we justify our karmas?
How do we justify
Our karmas.
our
Karma.
karma? Well, the question was that in our life, we kill insects, as I said, in driving, particularly in the summertime. I mean, what do they call it on the screen? What do they call it? They call it some word they have for it. Anyway, that's why people are always doing their windscreen wipers, clearing away the... So you kill many living entities. And then you mentioned mosquitoes. So let me answer it to two kind of ways. The first thing is, and actually again, and this is the amazing thing, I think someone said at the beginning, someone said all the answers are in this book, or was that last night? Somebody said it to me, that all the answers are in this book. But anyway, there's one verse in this book that says, and I want actually Dina to quote you. There's one verse in this book that says, in the material world, every endeavor, so every activity, everything that we do, every endeavor in this world is covered by fault. So we can never do anything perfectly. It's just actually an impossibility to do anything perfectly. Everything has some fault connected to it and some problem connected to it. So in that sense, we'll never be able to achieve that perfection, if you like, in the material world. So yes, there are consequences. And actually, in the context of eating, it's a good one, because Krishna also says in this book, Patam pushpam param toyam yome bhaktya prayachati. And he's explaining that the food that he eats, and by definition, the food that Krishna eats, is the food that we should eat. So he explains about grains and fruits and all of those vegetables, etc., all foods like that. He doesn't mention meat, so therefore that's why we don't eat meat. But cauliflowers and carrots and potatoes, and apples and all these foods, rice, all these things, they're actually living creatures. They live. Anything that is born, so anything that's created, anything that grows, anything that produces children or byproducts, so seeds and all those things, anything that produces byproducts, anything that grows old, and anything that dies, in the case of vegetables, withers away, we understand that there's a spiritual being inside. It's a spiritual being there. So therefore, even though we don't kill animals to eat them, we do kill vegetables. So there is karma that is accrued from that. So that's reinforcing the point about every activity in this world is covered by some fault. So we don't want to kill something, but if we literally don't kill any vegetables at all, we're going to die. We're going to really find it hard. I mean, there are a few people on the planet, I think, who only eat fruit that has fallen from a tree. They won't even pick it. They'll only wait till it falls like that. But hey, okay, good luck to them. They're very hard to find because they're so skinny you can't see them. Okay, so every activity is covered by some fault. So we kill the vegetables. So there is karma that has to come from killing that vegetable. However, what Krishna says is, if you offer what you kill, as long as it's from the bona fide list he's given of fruits and vegetables, grains, etc., as long as you offer that food to me first, not because Krishna's hungry, Krishna's Atmarama, self-satisfied, Krishna's not hungry, but as long as you offer that food to me first, I will take the karma. I will burn that karma for you. You won't accrue any karma like that. So yeah, we minimize as much as we possibly can, we minimize killing. Now, you did mention mosquitoes, and personally, I'll just speak personally, whenever I go to India, I don't use one of those things that can zap them, you know. I only use the mosquito net, because it is killing and they're living entities. However, mosquitoes come under a certain category. There are mosquitoes, there are snakes, there are wasps, and there are scorpions. I think they're the four. That because they're aggressors, they come, like the difference between a bee and a wasp is that a bee will only sting you if it feels threatened by you. Whereas scorpions, wasps, mosquitoes in particular, like mosquitoes are desperate, you know, they need no invitation, you know, they will just, they just smell a human blood and they're after you, you know, like you can be as nice to them as you possibly want. You can serenade them, you know, in your room, you know, but they'll still come and bite you. So it's explained actually, not in the Bhagavad Gita, but in another book, it's explained that those four, because they're aggressors, then actually killing them accrues no karma, because they're coming and they're aggressive towards you like that. But still, because we're devotees, it's kind of like we still don't want to kill them. So what we would do is we try to avoid scorpions, avoid snakes. It's difficult in India to avoid mosquitoes, but with a mosquito net, etc., they tend to only be out in the early morning and then the evening, and you know, you can kind of avoid killing them if you're kind of put your mind to it a little bit like that. So yes, every activity is covered by some kind of fault. So we will do things in this world that accrue karma. But if you're engaged in the service of the Lord, Krishna is very merciful, he's very kind. He will actually take that karma away. It's actually described that if you clap your hands, you chant Hare Krishna, and you're clapping your hands in front of the deity, that once you clap your hands, all your karma from your previous billions and billions and billions of lives is immediately eradicated like that. So Krishna is very kind. He doesn't want us to be getting karma like that. So he will absolve us of unintentional or impossible to avoid karma. He will absolve us of that. But if we go out and actively engage in activities that are accruing karma, and we're consciously doing that, you know, killing animals to eat them is a classic one, then Krishna won't absolve us of that karma. Then we'll have to suffer the karma that comes with that. Thank you. You said you had two questions, but
No,
you covered it. Okay. Does anybody else have any question or comment they'd like to offer? So I can only
Why sometimes, all the time, like bad things happen to good people who never did anything wrong, still sometimes they suffer. Why?
And the other half of that is good things happen to bad people.
That's also,
Yeah.
we see them getting bad, but still, how this injustice?
I mean, good things are happening to Sarumi all the time. I just can't figure it out. You know, how she and bad things happen to me. I mean, it's outrageous. The first thing about karma, by the way, is that it's an incredibly complex subject, because there are all different types of karma. There's instant karma, that you do something and you get an immediate reaction for it. There's karma that is in the fructifying state. There's karma that's in the accruing stage. You're accruing karma. There's karma in the fructifying state. There's all different stages of karma. So it's actually a very kind of complicated subject. It's described, by the way, that when we leave the body, not just us, anybody, any living creature leaves the body, I think this is a nice explanation, or at least it's a nice visual understanding of the way it works. It's like being at an airport, you know, and they're deciding which gate you're leaving from. And then when they decide which gate you're leaving from, that plane is going to a particular destination. So you're in the airport and you're there early, you're there 5, 6, 7 hours early. They haven't named your gate yet. They're still trying to figure out where you're going, you know. So Yamaraj, that's his service, he's a servant of Krishna, his job is to determine where you're going. And he has, I think he has because it's 33 million demigods, but I think it's 33 million is the figure that's used. Anyway, something like he has 33 million personalities under him, working for him, working all this out. Because it's actually very, very complicated, you know, all the different things we've done, etc., and whatever, and why we did them, what the motivations were, the other things we did to counterbalance, and this and that. It's a very, very complex procedure. So there's tens of millions of people in the civil service, if you like, in Krishna civil service or Yamaraja civil service, who are determining where you go and what happens. But specifically, as it relates to your question, why do good things happen to bad people and why do bad things happen to good people, is that we see that from a relative perspective. We're seeing that from a relative perspective. Actually, one example that Srila Prabhupada gives, that not particularly for that question, but I think it nicely kind of helps to understand that question as well, is he says that, let's take for example, there's a court case here in the High Court here in Dublin, okay? And let's say the court case lasted for a month. So every day the judge was there listening to all the evidence and the jury was there listening to all the evidence against the defendant or whatever. And they've sat there from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock every day, 5 days a week, whatever, for one full month, and they've heard everything they've done. Then let's say you or me go to the court on the last day when the judge is sentencing the person. And we just walk in at sentencing. And the judge says, okay, I'm giving this person, 40 years. Let's say the person's already 60 years of age. I'm giving the person 40 years imprisonment. Only after 40 years can we even consider that the parole or whatever the person might get out. Minimum of 40 years like that. Or even he says worse, life, and we'll throw away the key or whatever the case may be. So you and me, when we hear that, we might, and we'll look at the person, the defendant in the dock. We look at them. Maybe it's a little old lady, and we look at her and she's got a little sweet kind of smile on her face or whatever it is. She looks the picture of innocence. We might think, wow, that's a really heavy, that's a really nasty judge. What's he doing that for? But we didn't hear all the evidence for the previous month. Maybe this lady, killed 6 million babies or something, in her lifetime, whatever it was that she did. So karma is a little bit like that. It's coming in all different stages and in all different ways like that. But we don't know what went on before in that person's previous life, or their previous life before that, or their previous life before that. So it's very hard for us to have an objective viewpoint on that. We might just see them in this particular existence, and they seem like a very nice person, but they're always getting bad luck, or they're getting all different problems are happening in their life. But actually we don't know what's gone on before, and that's the whole context of this verse that I quoted today, is that the soul, there is never birth nor death. Now, we actually analyze that and think about that there is never birth or death. There was never a time when we did not exist. Never a time when we did not exist. This life, I'm 57 years of age. What the hell is 57 years in the context of never was there a time when I did not exist? And we have to try and hold on to those concepts. They're very difficult concepts to actually get our heads around, It means that if you take 1,000,000 years and multiply it by 1,000,000,000,000 years, and multiply it by a billion seconds, isn't it? 1,000,000 years multiplied by 1,000,000,000 years, multiplied by 1,000,000,000,000 years, multiplied by a zillion, is that next? A zillion years? You multiply them all together and you get tens of zillions of years. That's nothing. That's not even the flick of an eyelid in the context of eternity. Because there's never a time when we did not exist, either in the past or in the future. So therefore, just taking a snapshot of someone's life in this particular existence here now that we have is really not showing us the whole picture. So it's very hard for us. So maybe they're good people and something bad is happening to them, but maybe they weren't always good people. Maybe there was a time when they weren't so good. And actually, it's described again in these different books. It's described that. Actually, and this lady, she's left now, but she was saying that she was born in Delhi, and of course we have some Indian people in the room. I've been to India many times myself. You go to a place like Vrindavan, which is understood to be the most sacred place in the entire universe. Now Vrindavan exists. It's 90 kilometers or whatever north of Delhi. You can get a plane to Delhi, you know, you can get out of the airport, jump in a taxi, you can be there in, you know, about 2 hours because they've got the new Yamuna highway. It's nice having highways called the Yamuna. Anyway, we have the M50, they've got the Yamuna. Anyway, you know, you can be there tomorrow. This time tomorrow, we can all be jump on a plane tonight. We can all be in Vrindavan tomorrow, and it's described as being the most spiritual, transcendental place in the whole universe. But externally, from a material point of view, what a mess! What a mess! You know, and there's still open sewers. You know, and that's why I want to talk about it. So what you have in Vrindavan, you've lots of wild boars, wild pigs, you know, and you'll see them, and they'll just stick their heads in the open sewers, and they're just eating the stool. You know, this is their feast, their Sunday feast, you know, just sticking into the open sewers and eating them. That's another thing, by the way, about the subjectivity of the material world. You know, if we were all in our right senses and in our right consciousness, we can understand eating stool isn't something that we particularly like to do. You know, like to do it's something that we never do. We've never done it. You know, it's an abhorrent thing to even think of. It's horrible. You know, it's a horrible thing to even conceive of. So we can look at them and see how, wow, what a horrible thing to do. What a horrible whatever like that. But then also there are higher living entities looking at us and looking at things that we do in this world. Like I was talking earlier, smoking cigarettes or whatever, and they look at us and think, but these crazy people smoking cigarettes or doing all these kind of crazy things. So these things are quite relative. But in the context of your question about good things happening to bad people and bad things happening to good people, it's described that those creatures in Vrindavan, because it is the most sacred place in the entire universe, what's actually happening there is that they're actually great spiritual people. But they did some mistake along the way, this or that, and they're getting the benediction. That's the interesting thing. It's a real benediction, even though from our perspective, subjective perspective, we wouldn't see it as a benediction, being in the body of a wild pig eating stool. But actually what's happening is they did something in their life, you know, whatever, and they have to burn off their last bit of karma. And when they leave that body, in another year or 2 years, however long they live, they will immediately go back to the spiritual world like that. So for us, we should never judge a book by its cover, is an English phrase that we have. And it's very similar to these kind of subjects like karma and broad philosophical subjects. We should never try to reduce them down to very simple kind of whatever and then come to conclusions. They're very, very complicated, very complex, but they have to be seen. They have to, at the minimum, they have to be seen in the context of eternity and not in the context of one particular lifetime that we're living right now. If we try to see it from the prism of just one particular lifetime, we will never get the proper conclusion. And actually we can end up being quite frustrated and annoyed and even angry. That's why people say, well, that question actually is a really good question, because that's the question that people who, for whatever reason, don't have the information or choose to ignore the information about seeing things in the context of eternity, get very angry towards God, and they want to blame God for everything. But actually, that's a very, very skewed. It's a very big misunderstanding, because God didn't send us here. We chose to come here. We're eternal spiritual beings because we've never not existed. So we have been in the spiritual world. And it's not that God sent us here. We chose to leave and come here. So that choice was ours. The system of karma is God's mechanism for educating us that it was our decision to come here was not a good decision. And actually now we should make the decision to go back to the spiritual world. And his system of karma is a tool, an educational tool, to help us to understand that reality and to get ourselves out of this material world. Because two characteristics in the material world that don't exist in the spiritual world, which really, are in many respects, are the clear definition between the two, is time doesn't exist in the spiritual world. And time in the material world is the curse of us all, because time I am, destroyer of the worlds. Time means death, you know. So time doesn't exist in the spiritual world, and karma doesn't exist in the spiritual world. So this good things happening to bad people, bad things happening to good people, doesn't exist in the spiritual world, because karma doesn't exist. So karma is just an educational tool for us to understand this material world is not the place that we're meant to be. As Prabhupada told us, the material world, and excuse anyone with sensitivities, he said the spiritual world is like a toilet. And what you do with a toilet is you go in there, you do your business as quickly as possible, and you get out. Same with the material world. We don't want to be in the material world. We want to get out of this material world. And then all these complications, karma and bad things happening, all that, it's all over. It's finished. Like that. But the main thing is not to see things through a very narrow prism of this lifetime. You have to see it in the context of eternity. But thank you. That's a very good question. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. I'll tell you what then. I'll take your question and this lady's question, and then we'll stop, because otherwise I'm going to go on too long, and my boss is going to get very annoyed with me. He's going to make sure I get some bad karma. Yes?
I just want to ask, we are always guided by the senses in the material world. Isn't senses the gift of the God?
Are the senses a gift from the God? A gift from God? To be honest, the answer to that question is exactly the same answer that I've given. I don't know if that's someone that you know. Yeah, you're together. To your friend, or maybe more than your friend. I don't know. But we won't go. But anyway, that is the same answer. The senses are something that come with the package of a body, and the senses are something that we can identify as something to make us happy and give us pleasure, or we can have the higher understanding that actually they're like a prison cell. They're like our prison cell, the senses, like that. So if you're saying that they're a gift from God, if we accept that, I mean, we could have another, I could actually get into that a little bit more, but let's just, because the time is a little short, let's say they are a gift from God, then the gift that he's giving us in relation to the senses is for us to understand that actually they're shackles that bind us to this material world. And they're a very poor gift. It's like, if you go to Brown Thomas for your Christmas crackers, when you pull the crackers, you get some fancy presents inside. But if you go to Henry Street and buy them from some shop in Henry Street, nameless shop in Henry Street, when you open them, the presents inside are really rubbish, So that's what the senses are. We can call them a gift, but they're a rubbish gift. They're a really, really bad gift, because they're actually binding us to this material world. And they're stopping us from experiencing our true nature and our true relationships and our true happiness, actually. They're preventing us from achieving that. So, yes, they're a gift, but they're a bad gift. And we need to get on top of them, and we need to control them, and we need to stop being bound by them and all the problems that they bring. But thank you. Yes?
So, back again to the karma project. How is it possible to bring humanity karma to zero, and if this world will be needed at that stage, it will not be needed anymore?
Very good question. To answer the first, well, let me answer the second part first. Yes, it wouldn't be needed. And actually, this world goes through cycles. This material, not this world meaning this planet, but the whole material creation, it goes through cycles. And currently, actually, we're coming to the end of a particular cycle. It just so happens that there's still another 427,000 years of that cycle. So, again, in a relative sense, that's an incredibly long time. But in the context of eternity, because the first cycle is 1,900,000 and whatever thousand years, and then the second part of the cycle is 1.2 million, and then the third part is, I think, 864,000, and then the last cycle that we're in now is 432,000. So we're already into the last of those 4 cycles. But yeah, the world goes through cycles, and it gets completely annihilated, and it only manifests again if it needs to manifest, and it only needs to manifest when there are spiritual souls, spiritual beings who want to come here. Now, for me to answer your question specifically, when will it never not be needed? That's way above my pay grade, as they say, But yes, in theory, if every single spiritual entity in the whole creation wanted to just serve the Supreme Personality of Godhead and his devotees, there would be no need for this material world. This material was...
Already how to bring our karma to zero.
Oh yes.
So you already
Yes. How you do that? And it's a wonderful question, and the answer really is for all of us. How we do this lady is Anne. What's your name? Huh? Nuno. Leo. Anyway, forget I asked you what your name was. That's too complicated. You can ask me what my name is. My name's complicated as well. Anyway, this lady's asking a very, very nice question, and just to repeat the question so we all hear it, she's asking, how do we, because the class today has more or less been about karma, she's asking, how do we eradicate all of humanity's karma, the whole planet's karma, not just our own, but how do we eliminate the whole everyone's karma? That's a wonderful question. And how we do that is we have programs like this in every single building in Dublin, every single building in Ireland, every single building in the UK, Europe, America, Australasia, Asia, Africa. That's how we do it, by promoting, look at us here even today. Today, if there there's maybe about, I suppose, 40 or 50 people in the room, okay? We wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for Srila Prabhupada, this gentleman, and there's a picture here somewhere quickly, just for those who are not familiar. But we wouldn't be here today, here we go, if it wasn't for this gentleman, Prabhupada, who came. Now when he came here, not here to Ireland, he never set foot in Ireland, which is another really helps with answering your question. He never set foot in Ireland, Prabhupada. He did in England, but never in Ireland. He was in Scotland also. Did he go to Wales? He didn't go to Wales, did he? No. He was in England and Scotland, wasn't in Ireland or Wales. But it helps to answer your question, because there's 50 people in this room now, on Sunday the 31st of March 2019. Okay, Prabhupada came in 1965 to the West, so that's like 53 years ago. None of us would be in this room if it wasn't for Prabhupada. One man, he was just one person who came all on his own at 70 years of age. And this ISKCON centre in Dublin is actually one of ISKCON's smaller centres. It's not one of its big ones, it's one of its smaller ones. So Prabhupada didn't even set foot in this country, but by him coming on his own at that advanced age of 70, we are now in this room today. So Krishna, there's one statement, Krishna is the ability in man and woman. Krishna is the ability in us like that. So Prabhupada, I was going to say wasn't a special person, he was a super special person. But he wasn't special in the sense that we can't be special. We can also be special. Prabhupada's specialness was his absolute surrender to Krishna's and his Guru's wishes. That was why he was special. And because of that, even at the advanced age of 70, he came and he has established this movement. And now we have, we're pushing close towards 1,000 centres around the world. All because he came at that age to start the first one in a run-down part of New York City. He started that one centre, and from that has mushroomed and all of these centres all over the world like that. So the way that we eradicate the whole of the material world's karma is by spreading this movement, distributing books like Bhagavad Gita, giving discourses explaining the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita, gathering together to chant the holy names of Krishna. This name, this mantra that we chant, we have no idea. I have full faith, but I have no idea, but I have full faith. This mantra is so potent. What it can actually do, it can just transform society. It can transform the hearts of every single living entity that just hear it. As an example, these are obscure things, but it does give the point about how powerful this mantra is in the context of we should just, at every opportunity, we should be chanting this mantra for ourselves, and we should be hoping other people can hear the chanting.